And she went, I'll just show a video. And I was like, that's why teachers show videos? She said this, she goes, yeah, I don't want to work. And I was like, the kids don't want to work either. And she was like, good.
Most of us would probably rather be watching a movie than washing dishes, playing video games rather than video conferencing with a boss about some boring work project, curling up with a good book rather than doing backbreaking manual labor. Nobody really wants to work. Or do they? Recently, a lot of workplaces have reported having a difficult time finding employees willing to work as lockdowns are lifted and restrictions rescinded. Signs with the phrase, "nobody wants to work here anymore," have popped up at fast food and sit-down restaurants alike to explain to potential patrons the establishment's inability to serve them. The reason why they're struggling to find workers is fairly obvious. Biden's signing of a $1.9 trillion relief bill, coming after other relief bills, provides $1,400 checks to Americans and extends an additional $300 per week unemployment insurance supplement on top of existing relief. For a lot of people, the amount of money that they're currently getting from the US government to not work is more than they would make actually working. So why bus tables when you can make just as much, if not more, busying yourself with the things that you actually enjoy doing? Clearly, a lot of people can't seem to find a reason to work if they're making more money by doing less. But here's the question. Are people really happier staying at home and collecting checks than they are working at a dead-end minimum wage service job? It seems kind of obvious, of course they are. They must be, right? No one wants to work in retail. No one wants to bus tables. No one wants to do back-breaking labor, right? I mean, I've worked in retail, and I won't sing its praises, but is there something about working that gives us a sense of satisfaction, of purpose in life, no matter how small, and that ultimately makes us happier and healthier than were we not working? Today, let's look at the psychology of unemployment as well as needs, and the outcomes of being unemployed for both short and long periods of time to discover if work, no matter how menial, is fulfilling and ultimately makes us happier than receiving welfare to spend doing exclusively what makes us happy, by first answering the question, can we be too happy? But first, and if you do find yourself sitting at home without much to do, or if you need a break from a long day of work, let me tell you about this video's sponsor, Surfshark VPN. With Surfshark, you can easily and quickly change your location via their desktop app or their easy-to-use browser extension to allow you to access all kinds of media that might be unavailable where you live or not covered by the media services that you're already paying to have access to. For example, recently I've been binge-watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel, shows which are available but not included in your Amazon Prime account when logging on from outside of the United States. So all you have to do is log into Surfshark, change your location to the US, and suddenly, bam, I'm in Los Angeles and enjoying some Angel. Surfshark's Clean Web feature also makes your internet browsing experience better by blocking ads, trackers, and malware. If you want to go beyond the VPN, Surfshark also offers an alert feature to tell you when your emails or passwords pop up online, and has a private search function to help remove spam from your internet searches. If you want to help out the channel and also want to access a world of media content to enjoy after a stressful time at the office or just in general, check out Surfshark VPN by clicking the link down below to get 83% off a 2-year plan with Surfshark, plus 3 months absolutely free and a 30-day money-back guarantee. That's certainly a deal to be happy about, and use to access media that makes us happy, because nothing makes me quite so happy as watching the musical episode of Buffy.
Spike sing a little song?
Would you say it was a breakaway pop hit or more of a book number?
Let it go, sweetie.
But with that embarrassing tidbit in mind, can we actually be too happy? In Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle is quoted as saying, quote, "Both excessive and defective exercise destroys the strength, and similarly drink or food, which is above or below a certain amount, destroys the health, while that which is proportionate both produces and increases and preserves it. So too is it then in the case of temperance and courage and the other virtues. For the man who flies from and fears everything, and does not stand his ground against anything becomes a coward, and the man who fears nothing at all but goes to meet every danger becomes rash. And similarly, the man who indulges in every pleasure and abstains from none becomes self-indulgent, while the man who shuns every pleasure, as boors do, becomes, in a way, insensible. Temperance and courage, then, are destroyed by excess and defect, and preserved by the mean." But Who died and made Aristotle in charge of ethics? Plato, I guess. But anyway, Aristotle believed that good societies require good, virtuous people, but he also proposed that to flourish, we need to find the mean, the right amount of each virtue in balance. By balancing virtues, which he defines as the center between two vices, we obtain eudaimonia, meaningfulness, life satisfaction. Was Aristotle right? Does experiencing nothing but happiness ultimately lead to misery? Obviously, happiness is a good thing. There's no dearth of scientific evidence to illustrate the positive effects of being happy. It's perhaps the biggest no-duh of social science. Or is it? We always have to back up seemingly obvious truisms with data. So, for example, Veenhoven, 2008, who conducted a review of several physical health aspects related to happiness, found that happiness was often unrelated to long-term health outcomes for people with serious health concerns, with a couple of exceptions. For example, happiness had a negative correlational effect on longevity outcomes for breast cancer patients, but a positive effect on longevity for inhabitants of a veteran's old person's home. Being happy does not necessarily then make us live longer or fare better when facing disease. In otherwise healthy populations, however, there weren't any negative effects of happiness on longevity, and across 19 studies and 24 observed effects, 16 were positive, while 8 still skewed positive but failed to reach statistical significance. In other words, yes, on its face, being happy is probably good for your health. It's not going to cure cancer, but it can lead to a longer life. So obviously we should all seek to maximize our happiness, right? Or again, can we be too happy?
I'm just exploring whatever fun activity pops into my brain. Like, check this out. I'm teaching myself how to do claymation videos.
Isn't this just so cool?
It is so cool. Ben is massively depressed.
To test the idea of maximalization of happiness, and specifically pleasure, in an infamous study, Old and Milner, 1954, implanted an electrode into several areas of the brains of male rats, and gave the rats access to a Skinner box-style mechanism by which the rats could manually choose to activate a small electric shock from the electrode. They found that rats with electrodes placed in their forebrain, specifically the septal area, quickly became overwhelmingly addicted to the stimulation of that area, pressing the button to activate the electrode more and more and more over time until eventually it utterly consumed their entire behavior. They ceased almost all other normal activities, including feeding, drinking, and even sex, just to press the pleasure button for hours on end. One rat in particular was observed to have pushed the button as frequently as once every 2 seconds by the end of the experiment. While I'm sure there are some people out there who might rather sit around all day and press a pleasure button while forsaking eating, drinking, and even sex, there's probably far more of us who, while we might like an instant dopamine hit, would also like to keep eating, drinking, and having sex, yet would probably be okay forsaking a crappy job in exchange for the pleasure button. Or at least we might think that we would want that. But in reality, we're not rats.
Rodents of unusual size? I don't think they exist.
We're a bit more complicated. And even though the button might make us feel good instantaneously, what about the uniquely human needs of not just sex, but of love, of friendship, of life satisfaction, of eudaimonia, a sense of meaningfulness? Would you be willing to give up all of those things to be able to receive a hit of dopamine whenever you want? Would most people? Wouldn't we inherently want more? It's important to relate the findings of Olds and Milner regarding instant euphoria to humans because, once again, we're not rats. But there are obvious ethical issues concerning conducting the same kind of experiment in humans, so we can't really directly replicate that study in people. However, we can get an idea from Hack et al. 2011, who similarly to Olds and Milner utilized electrical deep brain stimulation in various parts of the brain of 6 patients with obsessive-compulsive disorder and observed their experiences. They found that 5 of the 6 patients smiled at least once during the stimulation. At higher voltages, some of these smiles resulted in outright laughter. However, there appeared to be an upper echelon level in that once the subject smiled once, increased stimulation did not produce more smiling. Smiles and laughter were associated with mood elevation. Moreover, they found that subjects expressed decreased OCD symptoms when stimulated. Thus, stimulation made people laugh and feel good for a little bit, and may even have reduced their symptoms of this disorder. But this didn't necessarily have any long-term effects, as subjects did not see improvement in their OCD long-term after undergoing the procedure. A review of deep brain stimulation from Synopsik, Schleipfer, and Fins, 2012, further found that deep brain stimulation doesn't really align with what we would classically define as happiness. Their research cohort similarly experimented with deep brain stimulation in a 33-year-old German man diagnosed with OCD and anxiety disorder, and found that while at first he reported a feeling of relief, as voltage increased, this changed to a feeling of euphoria. He described it as like being on drugs, as his anxiety reduced significantly. However, at higher levels of voltage, while happiness increased, so too did anxiety, with the subject reporting that the happiness felt fake, and then his relaxation decreased. Sinofsek et al. Conclude the use of deep brain stimulation for enhancement purposes is severely constrained by the lack of evidence about its potential benefits, its risk of severe harm, and the risk of altering behaviors as it did in Olds and Milner, and as such, they suggest little rationale to believe that even if we could insert electrical stimulant into the pleasure center of our brains, that we would ultimately be any happier. Instead, at the upper limits of pleasure, there is a sensation of it being excessive, which in turn increased anxiety and decreased relaxation. While this is all extreme, do these kinds of findings relate to regular life? Is it possible to feel too much happiness? Do we also need to experience difficulties, say having a crappy day job, in order to feel the most relaxed and the least anxious? Well, there is a body of literature that indicates yes, we do seemingly want more than just feeling happy, and being happy can actually weirdly be kind of deadly. For example, Martin et al. 2002 found that individuals who were in the 75th percentile of cheerfulness, so happier than 75% of their peers when they were 10 or 11 years old, were estimated to be 21% more likely to die at any given time than those who were in the 25th percentile, happier than only 25% of people, including from abuse of alcohol and other substances.
You lucky bastard!
Moreover, childhood cheerfulness in this sample was associated with more drinking, cigarette smoking, and risky hobbies and activities in adulthood. Fredrickson and Losada 2005 found that students who were flourishing in school experienced more positive emotions than negative ones at a typical ratio of 3.2 to 1 in one study and 3.4 to 1 in a second sample. However, these researchers also cautioned that positive to negative ratios that were too high were also detrimental. According to their computer simulation, ratios above 11.6 to 1 led to decreased performance outcomes at school. Specifically, the extremely happy presented with behavioral patterns that became more and more rigid over time, making change and adaptation difficult for them. This indicates there are potentially undesirable outcomes associated with an excessive amount of positive emotions, specifically combined with an extreme lack of negative ones. More specifically though, these data are indicative that being happy as a child, having a happy, healthy, and may I say privileged upbringing does not necessarily lead one to more positive outcomes later in life. Therefore, Oishi-Diner and Lucas 2007 posited that there is an optimal level of happiness for long-term positive life outcomes, that it is not enough that one need merely be happy because of their access to money or power, but we also need to experience a sense of meaningfulness, of eudaimonia. And they examined this question utilizing several large datasets. In data from the World Values Survey, which polled over 110,000 subjects from 96 countries over 20 years, they found that individuals with the highest level of income, education, and political participation were not the most satisfied individuals. Instead, those who were most happy were those who also participated in the most volunteer activities. That is, being rich, highly educated, and politically involved produced moderate levels of satisfaction, while volunteering produced the most. Similarly, results of their analysis from a University of Illinois dataset indicated that the second happiest group of students tended to have the best performance in school grades and missed the least number of classes. In contrast, the happiest group spent most of their time dating and tended to have the largest number of close friends. Very happy people did not possess as high of a GPA as those moderately happy. Thus, people who are the happiest don't tend to also be the most successful, but instead tend to live more balanced lives involving socialization over work exclusively. Another dataset, which followed the outcomes of students who entered college in 1976 for 19 years, was assessed by Oishi et al. As well, and they found that participants in the highest 10% of cheerfulness in 1976 earned an average of $62,000 a year in 1995, whereas participants in the lowest 10% of cheerfulness in 1976 earned an average of $54,000 a year. Additionally, the happiest students were only 2/3 as likely to have spent any period of time being unemployed as the least happy students. Despite the seemingly positive effects on being happy on outcomes, moderately cheerful students tended to earn more than either of the two extremes. The takeaway here is that there is seemingly a causal effect in that people who are happier tend to be more successful, not that more successful people tend to be more happy. As higher earnings are often associated with higher levels of education completed, Oishi et al. Also examined data from the Australian Youth Transition Study, which followed children born in 1961 up until 1994, and analysis found that the highest levels of education were reported by those individuals who had a moderate level of life satisfaction. Instead, the happiest respondents were those who reported having long-term romantic relationships, yet were not the most successful education-wise. Again, these datasets provide evidence for the idea that the happiest people are generally not the most well-educated nor the highest earners, but instead those with meaningful social relationships. Finally, Oishi assessed 2 longitudinal datasets from the German Socioeconomic Panel Study, GSOEP, which began in 1984, and the British Household Panel Study, BHPS, which began in 1991, both of which asked subjects to report their levels of life satisfaction. Individuals with the highest incomes tended to report levels of satisfaction similar to those with the lowest incomes, while the highest levels of life satisfaction were reported by those who made slightly above median salaries. All of the data assessed across these 5 massive longitudinal cross-cultural studies seems to indicate a consistent theme. Money can't buy happiness. Instead, people in loving, romantic relationships with a lot of close friends who engage in volunteering activity, are less educated, and make slightly above average salaries tend to be the happiest people. Living a balanced life, then, seems to be the key to living a happy one, while those with low incomes and high incomes are seemingly equally unhappy. These results might be explained by the fact that being only moderately happy allows one to want more in one's life, and that this wanting more is a major motivation for income, education, and political participation, which ultimately does not actually make one happier. When people seek to maximize happiness and pleasure in their lives, then, do they actually end up being happier? Well, evidence from Mouse et al. 2011 seems to indicate not so much across 2 studies. Their first experiment surveyed adult women on how much they valued happiness, as well as their levels of stress, depression, and actual happiness. They found that people who were more concerned with being happy tended to live lives disturbed by an imbalance of positive and negative emotions, report lower subjective and psychological well-being, and more depressive symptoms, but only when they also reported having low life stress. That is, the girls in this study who just wanted to have fun and also had very few stressors in their lives were generally far less happy than those who were less concerned with being happy and were equally low in stressors. In contrast, there were virtually no differences between those who valued or did not value happiness but were also stressed out. A second study from Mouse et al. Experimentally manipulated how female subjects valued happiness by exposing them to a statement about how happy people tend to be more successful, healthy, and popular, while the control group read the same statement but with happiness replaced with the importance of making accurate judgments. Next, participants were exposed to a short 2-minute film that was either happy or sad. The happy film clip showed a popular female figure skater winning a gold medal, the audience's enthusiastic reaction, and her celebrating with her coach, while the sad film clip showed a happy couple in love spending a night out dancing, the wife's sudden death, and then ended with the husband arriving to an empty home. Subject's mood state and emotions were measured, and then she was shown images of 2 abstract polygonal shapes and asked how much she liked them.
I can pick up this
polygonal shape,
tell you its name is Steve, and go like this. Oh. And part of you dies. Just a little bit on the inside. Because people can connect with anything.
Finally, to test the stimuli of valuing happiness, subjects were asked questions about the short film, questioning if they felt disappointed in their emotional reaction to it. Those who had been told about the importance of valuing happiness expressed greater emotional imbalance and fewer positive emotions than the control group when they had been exposed to the happy film. There was no effect when the participants watched the sad clip. These data are indicative that women, at least, who had been told about the value of valuing happiness, who watched something happy tended to be more emotionally distressed. Applying these data to the real world, for those who think or are even told to think that feeling good is a virtue to work towards above all other virtues in life and then are exposed to a depiction of happiness that perhaps does not live up to their own life experiences or successes, actually results in a decreased lowered emotional state, perhaps as a product of social comparison. Social comparison is an inherent aspect of human society. We always compare ourselves to others, so for those of us who think that pleasure and happiness is important, when our lives are not pleasurable or happy, as they frequently are not, and cannot live up to the happiness seen in, say, a film about the life of a gold medalist, then we actually end up feeling more depressed. Focusing on happiness then, on pleasure ultimately may make us sad. A subsequent study from Mouse et al. 2012 questioned if the pursuit of happiness can also present as loneliness across a series of studies. In their first survey, subjects' degree of valuing happiness and levels of loneliness during a stressful event were measured, and they found that those who said being happy was important were also more likely to report being lonely during a stressful situation. Thus, a second study sought to experimentally manipulate these variables. This time, some subjects read that happy people were, again, more likely to be successful, healthy, and popular, and then watched a 35-minute film clip designed to evoke feelings of affiliation or intimacy from the movie The Bridges of Madison County. The clip features a farmer's wife meeting with a traveling photographer, ultimately cucking the farmer. In addition to questioning subjects' feelings of loneliness while watching the film, the researchers also gave participants a piece of sugar-free gum to chew before testing began, and then again while watching the film, collecting the gum to test it for hormone levels, including progesterone and cortisol. Saliva progesterone is a hormonal indicator of social connection, while cortisol is a hormonal indicator of negative feelings. Those who were told about the importance of valuing happiness reported being more lonely when watching the film and actually presented with lower levels of progesterone than those who had not read about why seeking happiness was a positive thing. That is, people who are seeking to be happy for happiness' sake are likely to not just say that they feel lonelier, but to actually have lower levels of a hormone associated with social connection. Ultimately then, if valuing happiness and even the trappings of things that we usually associate with happiness, like wealth or success, doesn't necessarily make us actually happier, and instead can make us physically feel lonelier and less connected, what does make us happiest? Could it be that thing, eudaimonia, a sense of meaningfulness? This question was assessed by Baumeister et al. 2013 in a survey of adults regarding their feelings of happiness and meaningfulness, and generally found that happiness and its associated variables were unrelated to feelings of meaningfulness. So buckle up, because we're about to go through a very long list of correlations to happiness and meaningfulness. Happy people were more likely to report that life was easy, that they felt healthy, that they generally felt good, were able to buy what they wanted or needed and had very little scarcity of money, that spending money reflected themselves, while in turn, economic fluctuations were negatively related to happiness. Feeling as if one's life was meaningful was unrelated to all of those variables. Both happiness and meaningfulness were negatively related to feelings of boredom, a thing one could easily feel at a crappy job or by sitting at home with nothing to do. The only variable positively related to meaningfulness was the perception that balancing finances reflected the self. Happiness was negatively related to thinking both about the past and the future, while meaningfulness was positively related to imagining the future. Both happiness and meaningfulness were related to feeling connected with others and feeling others were connected to them. And in turn, both were negatively related to feeling alone and anticipating spending time alone in the future. In terms of specific relationships, happiness was positively related to spending time with friends, while meaningfulness was positively related to spending time with family. And a belief that relationships were more important than achievements. Happiness was negatively related to arguing, while meaningfulness was positively related to argumentativeness. Further, happy people were unlikely to say that they were givers, while people with a sense of meaningfulness were more likely to say that they were givers who tried to help the needy. Parents with high levels of meaningfulness recalled taking care of their children more when thinking about their lives, while happy parents did not. Happiness was negatively related to stress, time spent worrying and reflecting on challenges, as well as spending time deeply thinking about things, while meaningfulness was positively related to all of those variables. Activities positively related to meaningfulness were working, commuting, praying, watching TV, which might not be the case now considering how freaking awful television is, cooking, cleaning, talking on the phone, having sex, and I suppose the ultimate result of having sex, taking care of kids, taking care of the home, waiting on others, worrying, planning, organizing, listening, reading for work or for pleasure, balancing finances, snoozing, arguing, meditating, emailing, social networking, and buying gifts for others, while happiness was either unrelated or negatively related to all of those activities I just listed. Further, people with a higher sense of meaningfulness viewed themselves as more wise, creative, and anxious than happy people, and were less likely to say that they wanted to treat themselves to rewards, so
I gotta treat myself. Uh-oh, Batman's crying.
all of these data seem to indicate that people may not be happy doing a lot of things, but they find meaningfulness in doing those things anyway. There is still some positive to be gained from something as insufferable as balancing a checkbook.
When it comes to choosing accounting software, there's no accounting for taste.
As we saw in Oishi's data, the happiest people are not the richest nor the poorest, but rather those with a slightly above average level of wealth and success. However, it seems that happiness is related to access to money in multiple different variables, while feelings of meaningfulness and having a fulfilled life were generally unrelated to financial concerns, again, besides balancing a checkbook. Thus, while it's possible that money can buy us happiness to a degree, it is easily influenced by financial fluctuations, and money does not appear to be able to buy us a meaningful life. Moreover, happiness is easily influenced by stressors and challenges, while meaningfulness is found in all of the challenging issues that might otherwise diminish our levels of happiness. As such, while some things in life will decrease our happiness, we may also increase our feelings of meaningfulness at the same time. And as we've seen, happiness alone is not the be-all and end-all of existence, and really doesn't even make us feel fulfilled long-term. Meaningfulness seems consistently to be related to relationships with the family, while happiness really is not. And we saw before that seeking out happiness was related to feelings of loneliness, so are people who are more satisfied more social, or do they tend to seek out more personal rather than social goals? A study from Rohrer et al. 2018 sought to examine the relationship between life satisfaction and social pursuits compared to financial or personal pursuits. German subjects' level of self-reported life satisfaction were measured in 2014 and provided a short open-ended response about how they might try to improve their life satisfaction over the next year. These answers were coded by inter-rater analysis into two types: socially motivated, such as spending more time with friends or family or doing charity work, and non-socially motivated, such as staying healthy or finding a better job. A year later, subjects were again surveyed on their current levels of life satisfaction. As we've seen before, being preoccupied with being happy seemingly makes us less happy, as subjects who expressed no strategy to improve their life satisfaction were healthier at time 1 and at time 2 than those with any happiness strategy. But when looking just at strategy types, those who had social goals at time 1 were significantly higher in life satisfaction at time 2 than those who only had personal goals, whose life satisfaction actually decreased, albeit non-significantly. That is, prioritizing happiness by focusing on the self ultimately does not seem to actually lead to increased happiness, and instead, socialization tends to be a bigger influence on feeling satisfied with one's life than wanting to make more money or even just get in better shape. Despite the fact that happiness and satisfaction seem to be related to social relationships and volunteering rather than personal goals, it seems that a lot of people overly involved in politics, such as the politics of protesting for a higher minimum wage or UBI, focusing on their own personal goals, are often kind of unhappy, at least superficially. So are politically active people generally happy or unhappy? We can find some answers to that question by looking at a series of studies from Kushlev et al. 2020, who questioned if happy people really care about societal problems. The researchers posit a Pollyanna hypothesis, that is, feeling good, feeling happy, joyful, or content, should preclude people from also feeling bad, concerned, worried, angry, or guilty, pretty logically, at least as it concerns current issues. Thus, the Pollyanna hypothesis predicts a negative relationship between the positive affect that people generally experience in their daily lives and the negative affect that people experience in response to specific events or issues. In their first study, students at the University of Virginia were questioned about their levels of happiness, read a short description of the events that occurred in Charlottesville, Virginia at the Unite the Right rally in 2017, and were asked about their past involvement with social issues, their current involvement, and their intentions to get involved in the future. The researchers did not find support for the Pollyanna hypothesis, in that happier individuals, when presented with the opportunity to do so, were actually more willing to still act in the present, helping the community cope with the aftermath of the traumatic local event rather than those who were generally unhappy. But because the loci of the Charlottesville incident being so close to home for UVA students probably tainted people's opinions, a second study polled subjects from across the US and allowed them to choose their own social issues that they were concerned with the majority selecting environmental issues, 26.3%, followed by concerns with the current state of the US government, 11.8%, healthcare, 8.8%, and racism, 6.6%. Other subjects, between 2 to 5% each, selected some other issue, including the state of the economy, wealth inequality, terrorism, global war, gun violence, loss of gun rights, decline in morals, humanitarian crises, women's rights, LGBT rights, immigrant rights, and illegal immigration. As before, happiness and involvement of the self in these issues in the past, present, or intent to be involved in the future were measured, including the type of actions intended, such as protest, contacting a representative, or donating to charity. Subjects were also asked if they would like to receive a newsletter to stay informed about their selected socio-political issue. Both generally happy and less happy people had a negative feeling about their selected social issue. Happy people were more likely to report being active in their chosen issue than less happy people. However, unhappy people who felt very negatively about a certain issue were more active than those less upset by it. Neither positive nor negative feelings were related to intentions to engage in future actions, and even previous action related to the cause was unrelated to future intent. That is, it doesn't seem to matter if people are happy or sad generally, nor if a specific issue gets them involved in either emotional valence. They're unlikely to do much of anything either way. Thus, while happier people might get a little bit more fired up about a social issue that makes them sad, they don't really intend to enact any behaviors that might actually change things. Happiness or sadness, then, have little to do with actually getting involved, and activism seemingly requires a state of emotional neutrality. At least in terms of happiness or sadness, anger probably plays a pretty significant role here.
Nuke the whales? You don't really believe that, do you?
I don't know. Gotta nuke something.
A third study correlated data from the US General Social Survey to see how concerns with social issues, specifically environmental concerns, were related to reports of happiness. Very happy people were generally unconcerned with climate change, while unhappy people were very concerned with climate change. However, very happy people were also far more likely to report being active in doing something about climate change and intending to do more to fight it in the future. What we can take away from these three studies is this. Generally, happy people can get involved in a cause and also tend to be the ones more likely to take action by engaging in charity or volunteering. As so frequently is the case, though, there is a chicken or the egg argument to be made here. That is, are unhappy people inactive in social issues because they are unhappy, or are they unhappy because they are inactive, and vice versa for happy people? Does volunteering, being social and being involved, make us happier, or are happier people more socially active? Well, we've already seen some data to indicate that people who are more involved tend to be happier. We have to ask in what direction this relationship lies. How exactly does something meaningful, like volunteering, interact with happiness? Well, an analysis specifically of eudaimonia and hedonic well-being and goal achievement was assessed by Thorenstein and Vitterso, 2018. To reiterate, eudaimonia is a feeling of meaningfulness, while hedonia is a feeling of pleasure. The researchers sought to understand if meaningfulness would drive people to obtain their goals more than the pursuit of happiness, and how goal achievement ultimately affects feelings of meaningfulness or happiness in a sample of Norwegian participants. Subjects were asked to set an achievable goal that they could pursue, such as exercising more or saving money, and were asked to report on their progress daily over the course of a week. Life satisfaction, emotions related to pleasure and meaningfulness, and personal growth were all assessed, as well as goal achievement. Hedonic well-being was unrelated to actions taken to obtain one's personal goal, while eudaimonic well-being was. Goal effort in turn was directly related to achievement of the personal goal, and achievement in turn was related to hedonic well-being, but not to eudaimonia. If that all sounds great to you because, well, it is.
Come on, strike me down, Zeus. You don't have the ball.
This means that we are inspired to complete personal goals because of a sense of personal meaningfulness, not because of happiness nor pleasure, but ultimately by obtaining those goals, that itself creates pleasure. We are more likely to grind away at a job that we kind of hate to get a promotion because we seek to better ourselves, more so than because we just want the promotion to obtain more instantaneous financial gratification. Meaningfulness is the motivator. Happiness is the reward. So a lot of the research we've looked at so far seems to suggest then that success in personal areas of our lives does not cause happiness alone, but instead tends to support the alternative hypothesis that meaningfulness causes success and that happiness is the result of achieving that success via meaningfulness and through other meaningful actions like socialization, volunteering, and generally feeling fulfilled by the achievement of our goals, rather than simply the possession of wealth or objects in a vacuum. So, are happier people more successful because they are happier and more well-adjusted, or is it that people who are more successful become happier due to their success?
That 80-foot golden cock and balls wouldn't be so satisfyingly turgid if it weren't for the entire continent you had to turn upside down to find all the ore.
Well, to sum up, a review of extant literature from Bohm and Lubomirski, 2008, and a subsequent review 10 years later from Walsh, Bohm, and Lubomirski, 2018, both found evidence that people who were happier first tended to be more successful in their careers, utilizing multiple different methodological processes, including cross-sectional, longitudinal, and experimental to help establish causality. These two massive reviews of literature provide us with some really good and very strong evidence, on top of everything else that we've looked at in detail so far, that success and money is not what makes people happy, but instead that meaningfulness arises often from mundane activities, and happiness arises as a result of finding meaning in what we're doing. Thus, we need to get back to the real question of this video. Are people happier working even at a crummy minimum wage job than not working at all? Even if it's not pure hedonic happiness, do we obtain a sense of meaningfulness, of eudaimonia, from working? If working, be it on ourselves or at a job, particularly when it's to provide ourselves with meaningfulness, can lead to greater happiness, what happens when we can't or don't work for a long period of time? We've seen that the very poor are about as unhappy as the very successful. So what happens when people cannot work and cannot seek meaningfulness through work because, well, work's not an option? And for much of 2020 and early 2021, work has not been an option for many people due to public health concerns. Because so many people have been out of work for so long, or working from home in some minor capacity for over a year, and if meaningful work can lead to happiness, we should begin our current investigation on employment and happiness by looking at what happens when people can't work. To get away from the COOF specifically, let's start by examining the psychological and demographic characteristics of those who have been outside of education, employment, or training, otherwise known as NEETs, against which we can compare people who have been left out of work for long periods of time over the 2020 through 2021 year. We can begin by looking at a study from Eurofound 2017 who examined employment, unemployment, long-term unemployment, and NEET statuses in adults in the EU between the years of 2006 and 2016. Long-term unemployment describes those unemployed for more than 12 months, but comparatively, a NEET is a unique category wherein one has been unemployed for that same length of time, 12 months or more, while also not being involved in any education or training. Because Eurofound collected data from both countries with more robust and less robust social support systems, these data can help us understand how access to things like socialized medicine and welfare systems can influence the long-term unemployed and NEETs. And that's pretty overtly immediately evident in that across these countries, the level of NEETs were mostly stable, but it did vary by country. In that, for example, Denmark, Germany, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Sweden recorded the lowest rate of NEETs, all less than 7%, while conversely, Bulgaria and Italy recorded the highest level of NEETs, greater than 19% in the case of Italy specifically. For the 15 to 25 age group, the highest NEET rates were observed in Greece, 22.2%, and Italy, 24.1%. That is, as of 2016, as many as 1 in 4 young people in those countries could be classified as a NEET. Of particular interest to today's topic, though, the Nordic countries tended to have the lowest NEET rates, at or below 7%. In general, women were more likely to be NEETs than men, such that in 2016 the female NEET rate was 16.3% compared to the male rate of 12.2%. The majority of NEETs, over 25%, are temporarily unemployed, while only 7% have some type of long-term disability preventing them from working. Again, there is a pretty immediate difference between countries in this breakdown as well, in that more NEETs in the Scandinavian countries tend to be NEETs due to disability or illness, rather than the other EU nations. For example, in Denmark, the share of NEETs who are long-term unemployed or discouraged workers is only 5%, and 10% in Sweden, while in Bulgaria, Croatia, Greece, Italy, Slovakia, and Spain, at least 40% of NEETs are long-term unemployed or discouraged workers. Taken alone, these data that I just rattled off seem to indicate that in countries with social support systems, such as the Nordic countries, people are less likely to be NEETs by choice. This doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, perhaps to outsiders, because of the social safety net in countries like Sweden, which, for example, offers the unemployed approximately $300 USD a week for up to 300 days and 450 days after unemployment if they have dependents. But by allowing people to more easily get back on their feet via using this social safety net, then yes, Swedes are less likely to be long-term unemployed than people of many other European countries. I would posit this could perhaps be a product of the Nordic tradition of janteloven, or law of jante, a social norm in Scandinavian countries which encourages conformity rather than thinking one is special or deserving of special treatment, but instead part of a larger social system, which is there for them when they are down, but also expects them to eventually contribute back to that same society. But hey, I'm an American, what the hell do I know? So instead, I asked some Scandinavians to give me their opinions on why they think that Nordic countries may have so few NEETs or long-term unemployed people despite offering arguably the best benefits for those people in the Western world.
When it comes to janteloven, I would say that has something to do with it, yes. However, to call it socially unacceptable or looked down upon would in my opinion be incorrect. I have never met someone who looked down on, say, me, when I had to benefit from welfare while I was looking for a job, but that's also where you have the clue, I think. I was looking for a job, something I made a point to mention when asked what I was doing these days by friends and family, or even just complete strangers. I believe it has to do with the basic mindset behind janteloven. You are not alone, you are part of a larger society. I was expected to try my best to give back to the society I live in, and so long as it was clear to people around me that I was trying, I was met with the same respect and common courtesy as anyone else most of the time. I would say the reason we have fewer needs, so to speak, is because we are raised in a culture that doesn't make being a NEET an option, at least mentally. You don't have to get a good job, a well-paying one, or even a glamorous one. So long as you can give back to your country, that's all that really matters. This same mindset is hammered into most immigrants I've talked with about the subject as well, which is part of what makes me believe that to be the main reason.
I can only really speak for Sweden in this case, and then only from our own experiences. I think it's also that we simply want to be something more, to do something with our lives, to not waste this chance, to not waste our essentially the early part of our lives, and to become one of those people that never have any fun stories to tell anyone else, to never really have any interesting memories to share with others. That is something I think a lot of people simply want to avoid, even regardless of what we tell other people, including ourselves. In Swedish it said, "Du måste skaffa dig ett jobb," which translated essentially means you have to earn yourself your employment. You have to work hard for it. You have to put in the effort to find the work you're looking for. You simply can't just sit around and think you are going to be given a work at some point or another. For better or worse, regardless of how well our welfare systems helps us move along, rather to keep us existing in life, that's more or less all it does. It keeps us existing. You won't exactly hear amazing stories or see a life of excitement from someone purely living with social welfare. At the end of the day, to get somewhere in life, you have to work for it. You have to put in the effort to get there yourself. At the bottom line, for the average Swedish person, in my experience, the norm is to work. The norm is to make a living. The norm is to keep complaining about work, both during and after work, yet keep going to work the day after.
But as interesting as these data all are on their own, I bring them all up because the number of people who could be categorized as NEETs has likely skyrocketed across the world since early 2020. And I say likely because we kind of stopped categorizing people as NEETs over the 2020 to 2021 year, and my guess is that's probably due in part to the fact that a hell of a lot of people are now technically NEETs, and plenty more have probably been unemployed for going on if not exceeding 12 months now. So let's look at the characteristics of NEETs and the long-term unemployed, and while these are not causal data, they could indicate something about the characteristics of people who have not worked for long periods of time. One thing that's been studied in regard to NEETs, in particular how they tend to view the future, was examined by Parola and Donsi 2019 in an examination specifically of Italian NEETs. Mentioned, nearly a third of all working-age people in Italy are NEETs, hence why the country is of unique interest in studying this phenomenon, which now likely describes a much larger portion of the world population than it did just a few years ago. The researchers compared Italian young adults between the ages of 20 and 34 who were or were not NEETs regarding their goals for the past, present, and future, being more hedonistic, futuristic, or fatalistic. Present hedonistic intentions involve things like wanting to go out partying with friends. Futuristic intentions involve seeking to achieve something and goal setting, and present fatalistic intentions involve being unworried about the future. Compared to students and the currently unemployed, NEETs were far less future-oriented. Specifically, compared to all other variables assessed, including educational level, age, gender, family, living and relationship status, being a NEET was the single strongest predictor of a negative vision of the future. Hedonism was predicted most by factors of income, and fatalism was predicted most by the education level of one's father and one's own education level. But for those who feel the future is hopeless, NEET status was the big determinant. But if everyone is a NEET, as nearly a third of the people in Italy were in 2019, does being a NEET have the same effect on well-being and future orientation as it does if one is a NEET alone? Well, a line of research from Clark seems to indicate that the effects of unemployment on well-being are inexorably linked to social norms. Clark 2003 utilized data from the General Healthcare Questionnaire and the British Household Panel Survey to understand how societal-level employment interacted with levels of happiness between 1991 and 1993. The unemployed were generally far more likely to be low in well-being than the employed or self-employed. They found, however, that individuals tend to compare themselves with those of the same sex living in the same region. That is, the well-being gap generally observed between the employed and unemployed is smaller in areas where more people are unemployed or employed. When unemployment is normative then, people are less upset about being unemployed. However, this was not the case in the entire population when examined in more detail. Specifically, only unemployed men saw a positive influence on well-being when the local population was higher in unemployment. This was also the case, only for men, when their partner was similarly unemployed. Moreover, the probability of reporting the highest degree of happiness between the employed and unemployed shrinks as others' unemployment rises. Those whose happiness dropped significantly after becoming unemployed were also far more likely to seek out a new job in the past week since assessment. Of those who were not less happy after losing their jobs, 42% of subjects unemployed in 1991 were still unemployed in 1993. However, for those who experienced that significant decrease in happiness upon losing their jobs, only 25% remained unemployed 2 years later. Thus, it seems that when more people are unemployed, as is likely the case in 2020 and 2021, while the unemployed may generally report lower feelings of well-being, this decreased well-being is reduced when more of the population is similarly unemployed as well. As such, if everyone's unemployed, it doesn't seem to bother us as much, and for those who are bothered by their unemployment, they are far more likely to seek out a new job, while those who aren't negatively affected emotionally by the loss of a job are more likely to remain unemployed regardless of social norms, but particularly when more of the population is also unemployed. To further understand the long-term emotional effects of unemployment, another study from Clark, this time in 2006, similarly used data from the British Household Panel Survey, the European Community Household Panel, and the German Socio-Economic Panel. As before, across all three datasets, the unemployed were far less satisfied with life than the employed. Evidence from the BHPS are indicative that the negative effects of unemployment are most severe at first and then are attenuated over time, such that as time goes on, people feel less bad about not having a job until they had been unemployed for more than 2 years, at which point life satisfaction decreased again. A similar trend was observed in the German dataset and in the broader European dataset, up until they had been unemployed for more than 2 years. Generally speaking, as in Clark's previous study, employment was associated with higher life satisfaction, and those who have lost their jobs report a sharp decrease in satisfaction, with a subsequent rise being observed for those moving back into employment. But when looked at in aggregate and compared to those who remained unemployed, the change in life satisfaction of those who did not find a job was statistically non-significant, again indicating societal level effects. That is, as happiness increased for those who re-entered the workforce, so too did happiness for the unemployed who did not. As such, as more people find jobs, the long-term unemployed become happier despite not actually finding work themselves. And despite these general social findings that when more people are employed, everyone is a little bit happier, just as when everyone is unemployed, the overall findings of Clark's analysis is that unemployment has a strong but well-defined negative effect on life satisfaction, and that the size of this negative effect is mostly independent of the length of unemployment. Most people just don't like being unemployed, but perhaps for some people, at least Brits in this survey, after being unemployed for a long enough period of time, eventually produces increased life satisfaction, albeit life satisfaction that's still lower than the baseline. Moreover, when more people were unemployed, again, the negative effects of unemployment seemingly are mitigated. Despite the fact that unemployment is less deleterious when more of the population is unemployed, remaining unemployed for a long period of time seemingly has a scarring effect, particularly for young people. In fact, it's arguable that one of the best predictors of an individual's future risk of unemployment is their past history of unemployment, as seen in numerous studies, including data from Gregg, 2001. His analysis found that for someone who had been consistently employed since entering the workforce before the age of 24, men were likely to have spent 21 fewer months unemployed on average by age 33. while for women who had never been unemployed by age 24, they spent 7 fewer months being unemployed by age 33. Greg estimated future incidences of unemployment based on the occurrences of youth unemployment and found that depending on the background characteristics, an extra 3 months of youth unemployment before the age of 23 leads to an additional 1.3 months out of work between the ages of 28 and 33 years old. Data from Eurofound similarly illustrate the significant negative effects of recent and past long-term unemployment on people of any age group, with the exception of those above age 35, whose unemployment period was also not recent. Further, this can have long-lasting implications, as Greg and Tomini 2004 estimated that youth unemployment imposes an average penalty of 12 to 15% negative decrease on an individual's wages by the age of 42. The longer one remains unemployed in youth, the more extreme the results by 42, such that a man or woman who remained stably employed his or her whole life makes on average about 30% more than someone who was unemployed for over 13 months in his or her youth. Eurofound data mirror the findings of Greg and Tomini in that long-term unemployment during youth has a lasting long-term negative effect on wages as far forward as age 64. The Eurofound analysis further reveals that this affects job skill level as well as wages, indicating that those who have experienced medium or long-term unemployment are more likely to be employed in semi-skilled and unskilled occupations. And this effect was stronger for those who experienced recent forms of long-term unemployment at any point in their lifespan. But hey, money isn't everything. So what about the long-term effects of periods of unemployment on mental health and well-being? A longitudinal analysis from Blanchflower and Oswald 2010 found that between the 1970s and 1990s, being unemployed was a negative predictor of life satisfaction in Europe and happiness in the United States, and was one of the strongest negative predictors of satisfaction and happiness besides being divorced, separated, or a widow or widower. Unless, I suppose, your spouse is insufferable.
Marriage is just like a larva stage for true happiness, which is divorce.
Unemployment negatively affected US men regardless of their levels of education. The researchers' ultimate conclusion was that the unemployed were, quote, less happy, more stressed, anxious, down, and depressed, isolated, unloved, rejected, sad, and most worryingly, suicidal. They also report that they have less hope for their future, have nothing to look forward to, and that their life lacks direction, and that they have little control over their lives. Page 15. What an uplifting quote. Further, Bell and Blanchflower 2011, in a study conducted when concerns regarding the 2007 recession were high, found that youth unemployment had a lifelong scarring effect on well-being. Specifically, their data are indicative that bouts of unemployment experienced before 23 years of age lowered life satisfaction, health status, job satisfaction, and wages for over 20 years later in life at around age 50. So if remaining out of the workforce reduces life satisfaction, if people are able to find meaning in other places in their life, can that help facilitate re-entry into the workforce after, say, a long period of a year or more wherein people are unable to find work? That question was addressed in a study of German participants from Rose and Stravrova 2019. They followed subjects between 2004 till 2014 to understand how life satisfaction influenced the likelihood of re-entering the workforce after a period of unemployment, and found that life satisfaction was positively associated with the probability of re-employment. Specifically, a 1-unit increase in life satisfaction was associated with a 3% increase in the likelihood of re-employment, such that the more satisfied one was with their life, the more likely they were to be able to re-enter the workforce, and that the most satisfied people were the most likely to seek re-employment. Overall, these results suggest that compared to their moderately satisfied counterparts, highly dissatisfied individuals have higher chances of unemployment and lower chances of re-employment. As we saw before then, very unhappy people are likely to remain unemployed, and it seems possible that remaining unemployed further reduces happiness, causing a vicious cycle for some people who likely find it difficult, if not impossible, to re-enter the workforce after being unemployed for a long enough period of time. And, well, due to the global pandemic, a lot of people have been out of work for a long period of time, and though it may be less deleterious to life satisfaction when more of us are unemployed, we should understand more about the scarring effect that we could potentially see coming out of said pandemic, particularly when so many young people seem unwilling to re-enter the workforce, at least at low-paying service jobs like fast food, and we can do that by looking to research from Scarpetta, Sonnet, and Manfredi 2010, who studied this scarring effect following the 2007 through 2009 global recession, which resulted in a 19% increase in unemployment rates in young people aged 15 to 24, in OECD and European Union countries. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which includes 37 countries, at the time indicated that low-skill workers were among those who struggled most during and following the recession, both in finding jobs and then returning to the workforce. So these data may give us a good idea of what we could see going forward as global lockdowns end and many jobs reopen or open to larger capacity. The researchers compared employment trends in this age group in the mid to late 2000s to trends in the mid to late 1990s. They found that young people faced a greater risk of unemployment coming out of the recession than did adults in all of the countries assessed, but some fared worse than others, with, for example, the unemployment rate of young people in Sweden being 4 times higher than that of adults, while it was 3 times higher in the US and twice as high in Germany. The differences over time during the recession were also different across countries, with unemployment among young people becoming far more prevalent over that period in Spain than in Germany. Based on 2010 data, the researchers predicted that many young people would continue to struggle to obtain employment going into 2011. In all countries, having been unemployed a year earlier in 2005 significantly diminished the potential for young people to find permanent work contracts in 2006. However, the degree differed by nation, being most pronounced in the UK, Belgium, and Italy, and least pronounced in Ireland, France, and Finland. Across all countries, those most at risk of losing all contact with the labor market were those who had become inactive and were no longer seeking employment, much as we seem to be seeing looking at the "nobody wants to work here anymore" messaging. This unfortunately traps many of those who stop looking for a job in unemployment as they remain outside of the workforce and ultimately become NEETs, a position from which it's very difficult to recover from. So, to avoid these long-term effects, is it better to take a job for which one is overqualified during a period where unemployment is more difficult, such as during a global pandemic, rather than remaining unemployed? Volsmer and Schack, 2015, utilized German socioeconomic panel data between 1984 and 2012 to determine if being overqualified is better than being unemployed, and found that the answer is kind of. With these longitudinal panel data, the researchers were able to track the trajectories of German subjects 5 years after being unemployed for at least 1 month and subsequently re-entering the workforce. For those who chose to re-enter the workforce in a job for which they were overeducated, after 6 months, 95% of them were employed, compared to 34% of those who did not take the overeducated position. Moreover, the employment chances of those re-entering the labor market in an overeducated job are 61% higher than those who remained unemployed, waiting for the right job to come by. This remained stable over time, such that even 2 to 5 years after re-employment, the effects range between 10 and 20 percentage points. In other words, people who re-enter the labor force in a job for which they are overqualified are far more likely to stay employed for a longer period of time than those who wait for a job that meets their educational qualifications. Job quality, however, was a different story. Specifically, 1 year after re-employment, the overeducated had a 40% decreased chance to work in a job that matched their educational qualifications compared to those who just remained unemployed. This effect persisted up to 5 years after re-employment. The extent of this effect depended on the existing level of experiences of the subject, though, such that early career workers benefit more from an overeducated re-entry rather than established workers do. For recent graduates, then, it's less harmful long-term to take a job for which they are overqualified than for those who have been working for a long time. To be clear, if you have lost your job, while you are more likely to stay employed working at a job for which you are overqualified, you're also less likely to obtain a higher position than those who wait for an appropriate position to be available. Perhaps in part because your employer might think you're slumming it in a position for which you're overqualified, which leads to a nasty cycle of remaining overqualified. And while it may take longer for those who enter the workforce in a job for which they are overeducated to finally end up in a position for which they are qualified after unemployment, when it comes to finances, it's probably unsurprising that it's better to take a job beneath your level of qualification rather than remain unemployed. As the authors found that those who worked tended to make more than those who did not, obviously. But admittedly, the difference in earnings was kind of small in size. So for people seeking to return to the workforce after the coup, but refusing to consider working in retail or in service when you possess greater qualifications, you might not be in the wrong for turning down a dishwasher position at Denny's, at least if you got a doctorate, and at least not in terms of its effects on long-term occupational outcomes. With that in mind then, is it better to just remain unemployed and live off the Biden bucks while you can? Getting away from money, let's look further at the influence of unemployment, particularly long-term unemployment, on not just life satisfaction, but on other psychological outcomes. Paul and Moser 2009 conducted a massive meta-analysis utilizing 237 cross-sectional and 87 longitudinal studies published between 1963 and 2004 to understand the relationships between unemployment and mental health issues. The most simplistic takeaway from this huge analysis is this: unemployed persons showed significantly more symptoms of distress and diminished well-being than employed persons did. The length of unemployment was significant in that the longer persons were unemployed, the more pronounced the negative effects of unemployment were on their mental health. This was so regardless of the decade wherein these data were collected, although men tended to be more strongly negatively affected by unemployment than were women. But hang on, these are all just correlations, and as such we can't determine which came first. Well, luckily the researchers also conducted regressions using longitudinal data to give us an idea of causal relationships. They found a significant increase of mental distress symptoms for subjects who lost their job between 2 periods of assessment, and a significant decrease in these symptoms in those who found a job between the 2 assessments. These causal type data then are evidence that unemployment is not caused by mental health distress, but rather the opposite, that unemployment causes mental health distress. The amount of distress experienced by becoming unemployed was ameliorated by finding employment, such that the level of distress reported after losing one's job was significantly lower than the relief experienced by finding a new job. Further, continuously employed persons showed a small but significant reduction in distress over time while working. This was the case both for adults and for young people leaving school. Employed persons who lost their jobs during the course of this longitudinal analysis showed more signs of distress than continuously employed persons at time 1 when both were still employed. In contrast, continuously unemployed persons showed more symptoms of distress at time 1 when both groups were still unemployed than those unemployed persons who managed to find a new job during the course of the study. This massive meta-analysis seems to paint us a pretty clear picture then, that it is not distress that causes unemployment, but unemployment that causes distress, and instead that finding a new job leads to greater well-being than losing a job leads to decreased well-being. But while these data make it a little difficult to argue the causality of psychological well-being and employment, all of these studies are based on self-report. So maybe people were just lying about their feelings, right? Maybe they just said, well, of course I feel happy to have a job again. I have more money. Because after all, as we looked at before, happiness is related to the amount of money that you have, although meaningfulness not so much. Well, hormones have a little bit of a harder time lying than people do, so for a bit of confirmation about the negative emotional effects of unemployment, we can look to Dettenborn, Bruckner, and Kirschbaum 2010, who examined cortisol levels in hair segments of employed and unemployed persons to understand the long-term buildup of the hormone over time. As previously mentioned, cortisol is a stress hormone produced to provide the muscles with energy during a tense situation. In general, the unemployed reported more stress, social isolation, and worries than the employed did, as well as more negative emotions and psychological distress. Upon examining hair segments, the researchers found higher levels of cortisol, both in segments that were closer to the scalp, about 1 month old, and further from the scalp, about 3 months old. So not only do people report being less happy when unemployed, their hormone levels betray that they really are more stressed. Despite this, it's undeniable that countless people hate their jobs. How then could it possibly be that people are happier working than being unemployed if they hate their job? I mean, I've seen Office Space more than enough times to know how much people hate their jobs. Perhaps it has something to do with the demands of the job and the ability of some people to disengage with the negative aspects of unemployment, which was studied by Kroner, Ratzel, and Silberesian 2012 in a sample of German participants. First, let me define what disengagement is. Disengagement strategies aim to protect the self against the negative consequences of failure. For example, distancing oneself from former goals, or blaming failure on external circumstances, or, because this is a German study, invading the Rhineland. Such that if we can explain to ourselves that the loss of a job was not really our fault, then we may be less negatively affected by unemployment, just as if we can if a job is demanding to the point of driving us mad. They found that, as expected, both long and short-term unemployed people reported lower life satisfaction compared to the employed. Additionally, the unemployed viewed their lives as more demanding than the employed and tended to utilize more disengagement strategies to explain the issues in their lives. That is, the unemployed believe their lives are the most stressful, and this in turn leads to decreased satisfaction. But this is likely due to increased financial burdens. There was a positive relationship between engagement, that is, accepting responsibility for one's life circumstances, and life satisfaction only in the employed and the long-term unemployed, and was the strongest actually for the long-term unemployed. Further, the more disengagement experienced by long-term unemployed persons, the group that also experienced the most disengagement, the higher their level of life satisfaction. Thus, using either method after being unemployed for long enough, whether people recognize any personal responsibility for their situation or not, they end up often being more satisfied than the short-term unemployed. However, the long-term unemployed also feel that their lives are the most demanding, and feeling as if one's life is demanding is related to decreased life satisfaction. While work often sucks, not working and therefore not knowing if you can make rent is in many ways more demanding than working a dead-end job, and therefore produced lower levels of life satisfaction. As I keep saying though, it's not really up for debate that a lot of people hate their jobs. So why would it be that these results seem so consistent that being unemployed has negative well-being outcomes, besides the fact that making rent's more difficult? And yet a lot of the data we've seen in this video haven't come from the United States, but instead from countries with a social welfare system. And yet the unhappiness persists. Well, maybe it has something to do with individual psychological differences. So to understand some of those individual differences, we can look to Pelaez, Fernandez, Ray, and Extremera, 2019, who sought to understand how emotional intelligence and core self-evaluations would influence the seemingly deleterious effects of unemployment in a sample of Spanish participants.
We won't really be keeping Spain under our control, but we do need to take care of their leader, because this is cringe.
Emotional intelligence describes a set of basic emotional skills, such as the ability to perceive emotion, to understand emotions, and to regulate emotions, while core self-evaluation is comprised of 4 factors: self-esteem, generalized self-efficacy, that is, the ability to feel as if one can accomplish things, neuroticism, that is a tendency towards anxiety, depression, and self-doubt, and locus of control, that is a feeling that one is in control of his or her own actions. Anxiety, stress, depression, and happiness of the unemployed were all measured in this study. Both emotional intelligence and core self-evaluation capacity were negatively related to anxiety, stress, and depression that might otherwise be associated with unemployment, while these 2 variables were positively correlated with happiness. Emotional intelligence and core self-evaluation accounted for 27% of variance in depression, 14.4% of the variance in anxiety, and 17% of the variance in stress for unemployed persons. These data are indicative that not all people will be equally negatively influenced by unemployment. Further, possessing both high emotional intelligence and high core self-evaluation capacity resulted in higher levels of reported happiness. People who understand their own emotions, those who have more self-esteem, are more self-efficacious, and lower in neuroticism are seemingly then less likely to experience negative psychological outcomes as a result of unemployment. A question some of you may be asking then, which I asked myself, is how does free time influence happiness for the unemployed? Well, Strizovic, Rachenkovic, 2016, examined this in a study of Serbians, 61.6% of whom were employed, to compare the well-being of both groups' level of happiness, life satisfaction, and latent and manifest benefits, which includes 5 latent: time structure, collective purpose, enforced activity, status, and social contact, and 1 manifest: financial strain, subscales to get an idea of the influence of free time. Employed subjects were more satisfied with life, happier, and felt a greater sense of collective purpose than the unemployed, likely primarily because they were not at risk for being confused for Montenegrin. Interestingly, the employed also felt more financial strain, and further, more frequently reported feeling as if they had nothing to do with their time, as measured by time structure. Both the employed and unemployed similarly felt as if they were forced to engage in activities that they were uninterested in, and both felt similar levels of social status. Regression analysis revealed that financial strain was a stronger predictor of satisfaction with life for the employed than the unemployed, as did time structure, in that the employed may have felt as if they had less free time, and that led to decreased life satisfaction. Thus, although employed people are happier, more satisfied, and feel a greater sense of purpose, things aren't so black and white, specifically as it concerns free time. While a lack of free time negatively affects life satisfaction in the employed when they don't feel as if they have enough of it, an overabundance of free time can also decrease life satisfaction. Because, coming out of the COOF, we're in a very unique position involving employment, it might be useful to look to a different but also very unique scenario involving employment, which we can do by looking to a panel analysis of happiness and unemployment from Winkelmann and Winkelmann 1995, who surveyed Germans between 25 and 65 years of age between 1985 and 1989, so before the fall of the Iron Curtain, which can provide us with some interesting insight into life before the fall of the Soviet Union in a country just on the other side of the Berlin Wall. I bring this study up not just because of how really fascinating it is to understand this time period, but also just because it's some rare data that might provide more context to everything we've looked at so far. they found that the percentage of unhappy West Germans steadily increased over time as the number of unemployed increased, but also that the happiness of the unemployed increased over time, while the happiness of the employed decreased during the same time period. This is not completely radical, and instead kind of expected based on the data that we've already looked at, in that when everyone is unemployed, the associated unhappiness is diminished. That being said, the percentage of the unemployed low in happiness was always higher than that of the employed. Those who were currently employed but had experience with unemployment were slightly less happy than the employed who had not been unemployed for a prolonged period of time. Finally, those who had left the workforce, likely usually being retired, were about as unhappy as the employed. As we've seen here time and time again then, the unemployed are less happy. However, it's interesting that their level of happiness increased over time approaching the fall of the Iron Curtain. And I don't have a good explanation for that, but I'd love to hear your speculations about it down below. And speaking of speculations, I think I've talked long enough about the data, so perhaps it's time for you to form your broader speculations on this topic as we come to a few conclusions. Over the course of this video, we've seen how there can be benefits to working, even working at a lower paying, likely crappy job, at least compared to being unemployed. Happiness is in some ways related to money and financial status, of course, but meaningfulness generally is not. Moreover, the happiest people are not necessarily the richest, and instead happiness is oft obtained through a healthy work-life balance where we maximize both hedonism and eudaimonia. Simply having something for nothing doesn't really make us feel good, nor does it really make us value that thing. Instead, relationships with family and friends, volunteering and being involved are the things that make us deeply satisfied long term. And while of course it's nice to have the time to involve ourselves in our hobbies and passions, without also finding some meaningful activity, no matter how trivial that activity may be, it seems that a key part of not just happiness, but meaningfulness is lost. But hey, what do you guys think? I spent a good 3 months being unemployed in my mid-20s, and it was the most depressing period of my life. But that's just me. Even if you don't like your job, do you find that working gives you a sense of meaning? Do you think you would be happier staying at home on your Biden bucks, or happier working no matter how crappy the job is? Have you ever experienced negative psychological effects from being unemployed? And if so, do you think those feelings were more related to just not having as much money as you would like, or more due to lacking a sense of purpose, even if it's just getting out of the house for a few hours? As for me, I'm a firm believer that it's not all about the money. It's about the journey, the struggle that brings meaning. But let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. And before you do, let me leave you with the words of Miura Kentaro. It's like stumbling on a rock on the roadside. It's a pretty small thing. The place you want to go is more distant, further off. So it's all right. You'll stand up and you'll start walking. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. Check out my sponsor, Surfshark VPN, and as always, dear friends, Altana Volt.